Hey, welcome back. This would be, I think, week 8. Anyway, we're talking about assisted reproductive technologies. We're going to do that, though, primarily kind of the focus of a lot of the things you have there to read is on the idea of procreative liberty, or the general idea as to whether there's a right to reproduce. So the key basic idea here, there's some interesting things you'll see, in particular in the Vaughan text, just about assisted reproductive technologies. Those are the things that are sometimes called the new reproductive technologies, but by and large they're not so new. Well, so many of them have actually been around probably longer than some of your lifetimes. They're not so new. Many of them have been pretty mainstreamed. Basically, they just offer certain possibilities, certain choices that in the not too distant past just weren't available. But the reason for focusing on procreative liberty, or that general idea as to whether there's a right, to reproduce, is just because of all the issues, virtually all the ethical issues that are raised by assisted reproductive technologies. Um, uh, are approached in very different ways depending upon how one thinks about such a right, basically whether there is one or not, or just what exactly its limits are in scope and so on. So it really makes a huge difference. There's a huge amount of it's very common for people to assume there is such a right. And then when you do, well, that actually sort of tips the balance when you're thinking about the permissibility or the whether or not certain technologies should be available or accessible and so on. It really tips the balance in their favor, right? Away from approaching issues of reproduction in a broader context, thinking more about the possible negative implications for others, first and foremost the possible children that might emerge from such procedures and so on. In which case the whole sort of vista, the whole scene, whatever, of assisted reproductive technology takes on a very different character, right? When you take out of the equation the idea of there being a fundamental individual right for people to have or to be able to make use of such things. So that's why in this week we're focusing primarily on that, and then next week we kind of follow up along the same lines, but then look a little bit more closely at issues of so-called cloning, basically, which are a little bit different. Some of the more direct kind of ARTs, assisted reproductive technologies, as I say, in and of themselves aren't necessarily so controversial. It's just a matter of trying to ascertain the right sort of ethical limits, or what the scope ought to be for when they are permitted. So anyway, first of all, there's 4 things basically. So we have the Vaughan text as usual. Actually, it's a little bit better than usual. I think this chapter is a little bit better than some of the other ones in terms of some of the basic background, historical, legal, some of even the technical aspects. That's all good stuff in there. He's done a fairly good job. And then in particular with regard to the main kinds of arguments concerning ARTs. So generally arguments in favor turn to the principle of autonomy, typically kind of bolstered in the form of there being a very strong right to reproduce or to procreate. On the other hand, typically it's the principle of non-maleficence, about avoiding doing certain kinds of harm to others, that typically gets occluded, typically gets kind of overlooked when you're thinking solely or exclusively in terms of autonomy or of individual choice and so on. But that's usually the way that that's put in check, is to try to step back and take a broader view, and that's what some of the other readings do. So the readings are kind of based around the one from John Robertson. The others basically refer to him. Not necessarily that piece, but the general ideas that he's expressing there. So he's putting forward a very strong case in favor of a right to reproduce, a strong conception of procreative liberty. Now that can mean, and it encompasses quite a few things, so the right to reproduce, but also and equally the right not to reproduce. But here we're just going to kind of focus on understanding that in terms of the right to reproduce in terms of genetic reproduction, passing along one's genes, so to speak, which can be done in different ways. Usually we're thinking about when that happens with the intention of rearing a child, but that doesn't have to necessarily be part of the case. So basically, Robert's view is that there is a strong interest in this. That this is just a very important thing for human beings in general to reproduce genetically. Some may not want to, that's okay, but it's a fundamental interest, a procreative interest, as he calls it. And it's basically on those grounds that he wants to affirm that it's a very strong right? One that has what he calls presumptive primacy. That means kind of basically, we're going to presume that that right ought to be respected unless, he does allow for this, right? Unless there are some very strong reasons against it. So he's very emphatic about that. He's actually not arguing for an unlimited right. Typically, no rights are unlimited. He's just saying what it would take to limit it has to be something very substantial, very tangible harm to others that can be demonstrated. So talking about things being tangible, by the way, he's just trying to emphasize it's not about people being offended or bothered or having it conflict with their religious views. It has to be more concrete than that. The other thing to emphasize is he's emphatic that this is a negative right. So that's a kind of language that gets used in ethics and in political philosophy, that a negative right just means that you have the right or you should be at liberty to do what you want to do. Nobody should interfere with you. Nobody should get in your way. But it doesn't mean anybody has to help you. It doesn't mean they have to provide anything for you. So generally, he's just saying people should be free, not to be interfered with if they wanted to take advantage of or make use of certain ARTs. It doesn't include any obligation on anyone else's part, medical or otherwise, to provide such options. But if they are indeed available, then nobody should get in anybody's way if they want to make use of them. So in a nutshell, that's Robertson's view. Human beings have a deep and significant interest in genetic reproduction. For some people, that would require the use of assisted reproductive technologies. Therefore, they should be allowed, within their means and so on, and within their own desires, to make use of such things, unless, and only when there is some kind of very serious, substantial harm that would cause to others. But otherwise, he thinks it should be clear. That's the sense of the presumptive primacy of this right. The second piece, Ramora Ryan, basically, in a sense definitely takes issue with Robertson, as you can see. Not necessarily at the most fundamental level. She does not directly deny that there is such a right. She basically just wants to place more emphasis on the possible ways in which it might be limited or constrained. Robertson doesn't really do that. She's going to play up the other side. She doesn't want to say there isn't such a right whatsoever, but just emphasizing the possible kinds of harm that she thinks are typically overlooked. So these have to do firstly with the children that may emerge from the procedures, basically where they're considered in effect as commodified objects. She thinks that can be problematic, at least just a generally problematic view about children, people kind of ordering children and so on. She thinks it leads to a conception of family life that is weirdly contractual, right? Contractual relations are things that might occur in society at large, but she thinks families now are kind of being understood more in contractual terms, the way that you might contract with a surrogate or a sperm or egg donor or something. She thinks kind of works its way into the family itself when the children are being raised. And likewise, she thinks that's problematic and that can potentially lead to harm. And the third thing is most general, I guess, was just about the wider ramifications of this. And this may be the most sort of useful point in some ways. It's sort of the most general, but that's kind of useful. Just the way that when we're usually, or certainly from Robertson's perspective, the way we think about ARTs tends to separate the means and ends of reproduction. And that's really the source of all these problems, I think, in Ryan's mind anyways, that we need to really just recognize that, if we're thinking about them as means when we think about them only in connection with individual wants and desires and aspirations, whatever, as regard genetic reproduction and possibly parenthood. What we need to do is just put those back together a little bit more. All right, so that the considerations about our obligations to others and what it would really mean to bring a child into the world and so on are taken more seriously. She doesn't think this is just ruling out, any kind of right to procreation or whatever. It's just a more balanced view, I think, is what she's trying to put forward there. But just keep this in mind. I mean, in a sense, and this is why I said she doesn't sort of, at the deepest level, directly disagree with Robertson, because Robertson, as you noted, already includes the provision to limit the right. He never really claims it's unlimited. So in that sense, whenever Ryan's talking about arguing against unlimited procreative liberty, it's not exactly what Robertson was saying. Now, he just set the bar very high and made it seem as if in most cases it's never reached. There is no sufficiently substantial harm, so everything's good. Whereas Ryan seems to want to be saying, well, I think that bar is actually lower. When we look at more things, take more into account, then we realize that in more cases than we might have thought, there's going to be issues that would, probably alter the terms in terms of which we're thinking about the ARTs, basically. But there's no direct. She's just emphasizing the limitations more. They were already there in Robertson. She's just playing them up. So the final step, though, we have from Yvette Pearson, basically, is to just go a little bit further and say, actually, maybe it's not even the best thing to think about these issues in terms of a kind of a conflict between, on the one hand, the right to procreate, on the other hand, certain obligations that may be owed to others, because really, maybe there isn't a strong right in the first place, right, of procreative liberty. Perhaps that's more kind of rhetorical than real as far as ethics is concerned. She doesn't think that there's ever been a very clear, precise, and unambiguous formulation of that. It certainly exists. People talk about it. It's very important for the ART industry, basically, for people to think there's a right, because once you stop thinking there is, then a lot of the felt need for their services would disappear. So we can relate it to Robertson in this way. She can agree with Robertson. She can say, maybe. I mean, she's sort of ambivalent. It doesn't really matter, but she could certainly allow there to be some sort of genuine procreative interest. Can say, okay, fine, but simply point out that in and of itself, that does not generate a right, a right that would be significant and meaningful in the sense of overriding or outweighing the other sorts of considerations that are very clearly relevant and important in the context of human reproduction. So in a sense, just taking a step further than Ryan, right? Ryan is sort of caught in this kind of conflict. Well, there may be such a right, but there are these other considerations. And then Pearson says, let's just not worry about the right. We don't have to take that so seriously. We should just think about reproduction, or, by and large, for the most part, in terms of the obligations to others, but especially and first and foremost, the possible children that may be produced from this. That's probably the right way to think about human reproduction, right? We can have in mind that it's very important to people. Of course it is. Lots of things are, right? All kinds of things are, but in many, many cases, that is just not enough to generate a serious and strong kind of right that ought to be respected no matter what, or almost no matter what. So she just shifts it more entirely to the other side, sort of the opposite of Robertson, basically. In many cases, the outcome may be the same, who knows, but basically just when we are thinking about these things, first and foremost, what really should be in front of our minds are the various kinds of obligations, what is owed, and, when we're taking these steps, which are really quite momentous. Anyways, I got to wrap up. I'm running out of time here. I try to be brief, but hopefully this is useful. So be thinking about that. Have a look at the text. They're not too hard, hopefully. Some of the passages we didn't spend a whole lot of time on, but work through it all. For discussion, we'll be talking about this right. You can relate it to ARTs. You don't directly have to, but as I mentioned at the outset, it makes a big difference, basically, whenever you are thinking about ARTs, whether you're coming at it from a position that says there is indeed a right to procreate or not. It makes a world of difference. It's the single biggest kind of issue. It kind of lurks in the background, so it's quite useful to bring it out and talk about it here. Anyway, that's all for now, so see you later.